You know what's interesting? When people talk about rare cars, they usually look at the US, Europe, maybe Japan, but almost nobody ever talks about Canada. And that's surprising, because Canada quietly produced some of the most unusual, forgotten, and low-production cars in North American history. Cars that looked familiar on the outside, but were built on completely different platforms. Cars that were sold only in Canada and in numbers so small most enthusiasts today don't even know they existed. These weren't exports, they weren't rebadged afterthoughts. They were unique machines created for a very specific market, and over time, many of them simply disappeared, scrapped, overlooked, or mistaken for something more common. So today, we're digging up 3 of the rarest Canadian cars you've probably never seen before, and the stories behind why they existed in the first place. And if you enjoy discovering hidden automotive history like this, make sure you're subscribed, because on this channel, we don't just talk about famous legends, we bring back the cars that history almost erased. Now, we're not going to drag this out. Let's jump straight into some of the rarest Canadian machines ever put on the road and see just how different the Canadian car world really was. Most people have never even heard of the Mercury M100, and that's because outside of Canada, it practically didn't exist. If you showed this truck to an American enthusiast in the 1950s, they'd probably think it was just a rebadged Ford pickup. But in Canada, the story was very different. You see, back then, the Canadian auto market worked on a completely separate dealership structure. Mercury dealers needed trucks to sell, but they didn't have access to Ford's truck lineup the way US dealers did. So instead of losing customers, Ford of Canada did something unusual. They built trucks under the Mercury name, not as a gimmick, but as a real working product line. And that's how trucks like the M100 came to life. Visually, it carried that classic mid-50s workhorse design, rounded steel body panels, upright grille, and a stance built for function over style. But the Mercury identity gave it a slightly more upscale feel compared to its Ford counterparts. Different badging, different trim touches, a subtle sense that this wasn't just a farm truck, it was something tailored to a different kind of buyer. Underneath, it shared proven Ford mechanicals, built for torque, durability, and long-haul reliability rather than speed. These trucks were made to survive Canadian realities, freezing winters, muddy job sites, long rural distances, and because of that, they weren't preserved, they were used until there was nothing left to use. Most were scrapped after years of hard labor. Very few were restored, and even fewer made it outside Canadian borders. Today, spotting a Mercury M100 feels less like finding a classic truck and more like uncovering a forgotten branch of North American automotive history, a vehicle created not for global recognition, but to solve a very specific Canadian market need, quietly, practically, and almost completely unnoticed by the rest of the world. If you saw a 1964 Strato Chief parked on the street, you'd probably think you were looking at a regular American Pontiac. Wide stance, stacked headlights, classic mid-60s Pontiac grille, everything about it looked familiar. But here's where it gets interesting, because the Strato Chief you'd find in Canada wasn't built the same way as the Pontiac sold in the United States. In fact, underneath the body, it wasn't even on a traditional Pontiac platform. Canada had its own automotive reality. Smaller population, different import taxes, and tighter production costs meant manufacturers had to get creative. So General Motors of Canada did something clever. They built Canadian Pontiacs using Chevrolet chassis and drivetrains, then dressed them in Pontiac styling. And the Strato Chief became one of the clearest examples of that formula. From the outside, buyers got the prestige of a Pontiac, the look, the identity, the road presence. But underneath, you were essentially driving Chevrolet engineering, Chevy frames, Chevy suspensions, Chevy powertrains. It was a hybrid solution designed purely for the Canadian market. And for buyers back then, it made sense. You got Pontiac style at a lower price point with simpler mechanical servicing thanks to Chevrolet parts availability. But over time, that uniqueness is exactly what made cars like the Strato Chief so rare.
because collectors later gravitated toward true American Pontiacs, the performance models, the big block legends. Canadian variants like this were overlooked, seen as budget alternatives rather than unique market adaptations. So many were driven hard, traded off, or scrapped without much thought. Today, the 1964 Strato Chief stands as a fascinating reminder that not all Pontiacs were created equal. It looked like a full-blooded American cruiser, but in reality, it was a uniquely Canadian creation, blending identity and practicality in a way most enthusiasts never realized existed.
At first glance, the 1960 Pontiac Laurentian looks like a full-blooded American luxury cruiser. Long body, dramatic tail fins, massive chrome bumpers, everything about it screams late 50s to early 60s North American excess. It looks like the kind of car built to glide down highways for miles without effort. And visually, that's exactly what it was meant to be. But here's what most people outside Canada never realized. The Laurentian wasn't built the same way as the Pontiacs sold in the United States. Just like several Canadian market models of the time, it followed a completely different production formula. General Motors of Canada needed to offer full-size Pontiacs, but building them on true Pontiac platforms was far more expensive for the smaller Canadian market. So they engineered a solution that blended identity with practicality. The Laurentian wore full Pontiac styling, the bold grille, the sweeping body lines, the luxury presence buyers expected from the brand. But underneath, it rode on Chevrolet architecture, Chevy frames, Chevy suspension setups, and often Chevrolet engines. It was a full-size Pontiac in appearance, but mechanically tied to a different lineage entirely. For Canadian buyers, this actually worked in their favor. Maintenance was easier, parts were more accessible, and the car delivered the same road presence without the higher cost of its American counterpart. On the road, the Laurentian felt exactly how a luxury cruiser should feel. Smooth, stable, built for long distances rather than aggressive performance. It wasn't about speed, it was about presence. The kind of car you drove across provinces, not drag strips. But as decades passed, collectors gravitated toward US-built Pontiacs, the performance icons, the big block legends. Canadian full-size cruisers like the Laurentian were overlooked, seen as regional variants rather than historically unique vehicles. So many faded away quietly, driven for years, retired, and eventually scrapped. Today, spotting a 1960 Pontiac Laurentian feels like uncovering a hidden chapter of Pontiac history. A car that looked every bit American luxury on the surface, but underneath told a very different and very Canadian story.